Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the T-72 main battle tank, and we're going to be taking a brief look at some of its design features, some of its history, and determining if perhaps it maybe isn't a little underrated on the modern battlefield. That's not to say that it's necessarily great, but it does have something of a harsh reputation, and we're going to kind of be looking at whether or not that reputation is wholly deserved. And of course, this is a bit of a companion video to whether or not the Abrams is overrated, and as I discussed in that video, a lot of the question with rating a vehicle is on what standards are you rating it and who is doing the rating. But we'll get into that more as we look into the video itself. And of course, with any modern Russian main battle tank, it's hard to not start with talking about the grandmother of the entire line of modern Russian tanks, the T-64. The T-64 was relatively advanced for its time in the 1960s, featuring composite armor, gun stabilizer, also featured a new lightweight and compact engine, and was one of the first Russian tanks to feature the 125mm cannon with the autoloader, although it was a slightly different version of the cannon than what we see on Russian tanks today. As a piece of useless trivia, the original T-64s did release with 115mm, however this was quickly upgraded in the T-64A to the 125, that is a lot more iconic. Now, the thing with the T-64 was that while it was a relatively advanced tank for the time, it was also somewhat expensive and somewhat complicated to manufacture. Specifically, things like the engine and the composite armor in the hull represented a bit of a production bottleneck. So the Soviet Union, after realizing this and not really being confident that they could produce them in the numbers needed should they get into a full-scale war with NATO, started looking at alternatives to the T-64. The new program sought to simplify production and also loosen a lot of the bottlenecks by allowing it to use larger engines that were maybe not quite as small and not quite as efficient, and also using simpler armor compositions. And this was originally called the T-64 mobilization model, but this was later reflagged into what would become known as the T-72. Now, this puts the T-72 in a bit of an awkward spot in terms of discussing whether or not it's overrated or underrated, in that it was never really designed to be good. From inception, they knew they had a better tank, they just weren't sure they could produce enough of that better tank. So going into any discussion about the T-64, you have to have that understanding that the tank was not designed to be the best thing on the battlefield or even the best thing they could produce in quantity. It was simply designed to buff out the numbers of Soviet forces so that they could afford to field these other better tanks. Notable visual features that differentiate the T-72 from the T-64. First off, because it does have to have the larger engine compartment to accommodate more traditional engines, it is slightly larger. If you put them right next to each other you would notice, but at a distance it's hard to tell. The T-64 also features small all-metal road wheels, which are pretty easy to distinguish, whereas the T-72 features a more traditional type of road wheel. And lastly, the T-72 does feature the single-piece driver's vision periscope instead of the three-piece that you'll see on vehicles like the T-64 or the T-80s. So those are the easiest ways to visually distinguish the T-72 from some of its sisters. Now, what's notable with Russian tanks is part of the reason why they're able to achieve their compact size. There are actually two main factors. Number one, the engine and transmission are relatively compact. This often means skimping on the reverse gears. So the T-72 in particular had a reverse gear of around 5 kilometers an hour. Typically, when people say it moves at a brisk walking pace, they're exaggerating. In the case of T-72, it actually does reverse at roughly a brisk walking pace. You could easily outjog this thing. Additionally, another way that they're able to achieve these relatively compact and lightweight designs is by putting all of the critical components in one place. This does create some interesting design compromises because obviously there are advantages in that you get a more compact frame and you have less surface area to armor. But also, if anything does enter that part of the vehicle, you're going to have some very serious problems. The T-72 has often been the weakest of its sisters in terms of its base armor value, that is to say the underlying rolled homogeneous armor plus composites that you have on areas like the upper front plate and the turret. This is because usually the better armored compositions are reserved for the more valuable tanks, quote unquote, so it's pretty common for contemporary T-80s and T-90s to have better compositions in terms of their armor on the upper front plate and the turret face than the T-72. It's also very noteworthy that once this armor composition started to become inadequate, it was not very easy to buff it because it turns out when you have a very small internal surface area and a very small outer surface area, it's a lot harder to expand that area. So they're trying to improve the composites within the same surface area, and that gave a lot of diminishing returns. The percentage points you could improve it by were reduced. So instead what they turned to was using explosive reactive armor. The first generation of explosive reactive armor, Contact 1, often looks like it's haphazardly welded to the tanks, and that's because it kind of sort of is, or at least it was originally. They're designed to be relatively small explosive reactive armor blocks. They only really protect against heat rounds, and the idea was that you could just weld them to the outside of the tank. This does result in a bit of a haphazard look. Now, later versions did start adding frameworks that you could put on, especially around the turret, but you'll still see a lot of them that looks like they're kind of just welded on wherever they could fit them. Now, you might think that welding explosive reactive armor, because these are specifically explosive panels, wouldn't end that well, but it turns out it takes a lot of energy to detonate these. They're designed to stop things like APFSDS rounds or heat rounds, things that deliver a lot of energy to the vehicle. So in practice, these are very stable. You'll even see images of these kind of Soviet-era tanks with explosive reactive armor where the tank is burnt out or the turret's blown off and much of the explosive reactive armor is still intact and it hasn't detonated yet. That's because even the tank burning or even nearby tiles detonating is often not enough to cause an explosion. So it's often overstated, but they don't really have sympathetic detonation or heat detonations like some people have assumed they do. Now, the explosive reactive armor did start to hit a minor problem in that a lot of the Soviet tanks were not really designed with explosive reactive armor in mind. So you have these like round, flat frying pan turrets, and once you get to the point where you can't simply weld on contact 1, you need something much heavier like contact 5 to give you some protection against enemy kinetic rounds. Now you have a bit of a problem because if you take a drink coaster and you put it around a frying pan, you'll notice you're going to end up with some really big gaps because you're putting a square plate on a round surface. Some versions of the T-80s and the T-90s do kind of address this and try to reduce these gaps, but most of the T-72s, even the most recently reproduced ones, still have pretty massive gaps around the turret that are easily exploited. So even if the enemy isn't aiming for these gaps, they could potentially hit them and take out the tank basically through its strongest armor. All of that is not to say that it is impossible that you could put together an upgrade package that meaningfully improves the T-72's armor, but more that because the T-72 is thought of more as the budget option, it's a much lower priority to refine its armor package to the point where it provides significant meaningful protection, so it does often end up on the lower end of the protection scale for Russian tanks. And at this point, we obviously do have to address an elephant in the room in terms of both the protection and the firepower, and that is the 125mm gun, the autoloader, and the tendency of the turrets to come flying off of these tanks. Now, it's important to understand that not all autoloaders work this way. You have autoloaders like the one on the French Leclerc that uses a revolver type system that's located in the turret bustle and actually does use blowout panels, so that's a lot more stable and a lot healthier for the crew. But it is important to look at this design, and defenders of this system will point out a few minutiae in terms of how the system is actually laid out. So in the T-64 and T-80, the charges are vertically stacked instead of horizontally stacked. So they're kind of stacked up and down around the sides of the turret. In the T-72 series, they're actually on the floor in a little circular arrangement at the bottom. And this also extends to the T-90. The argument goes that the horizontally stacked is less susceptible to turret pops than the vertically stacked. Additionally, they will also point out that many of the Russian tanks, especially the newer ones, feature an armored basket essentially going around the carousel. The problem with this argument is that the instance in which the Russian tank turret pop kind of entered popular culture was actually the 1991 Gulf War. This was when it became a big thing because it was happening all over the place. And it turns out the tanks that the Iraqis were using during the Gulf War, at least from the T-64 family, were all T-72s with horizontally stacked ammo. And even as recent as engagements in Ukraine, you can see in this particular set of images, we have a T-90M. We know it was struck by a Sabo round and went straight through the side, and you can clearly see the turret is on the ground. It didn't go flying hundreds of feet in the air, but the turret still was basically severed from the vehicle, and the T-90 uses both horizontally stacked ammo and has the armored basket around the carousel. So one of the things that it's really easy to miss when having these discussions online is physically standing next to the tank and realizing why it doesn't matter as much the difference between like the carousel or the armored bend or whatever. And the problem is that all of these tanks are quite small, they're all quite low to the ground, and a lot of their surface area is their hull. So when you talk about vertically versus horizontally stacked, you're not talking matters of feet, you're talking matters of inches. And that's just not enough to provide significant protection for these shells from these incoming rounds. Additionally, it's also important to realize that Russian tanks actually use combustible casings for their ammunition. So it's not a steel casing with the round and the powder charge and everything. It's a combustible casing. You can actually see this if you watch the animations in War Thunder, or even if you watch them firing in real life. You can see the little cap flying out of the back of the turret after it fires a round. This is actually all that's left of the round once it's fired in the tank. The casing combusts and the shell leaves the chamber. The problem is these combustible casings are more susceptible to catching fire. And if you have, look at, say, the Abrams also uses combustible casings, but the Abrams also stores them in the turret bustle, or at least most of them. There is some hull stowage, but the hull stowage on the Abrams is a lot less numerous than it is on something like a T-72. So, yes, both the Abrams and the T-72 use combustible casings, but the T-72 puts those combustible casings right next to the crew, whereas the Abrams puts them in their own separate part of the tank that's also less likely to be hit. Now, it's easy as an armchair general to look at these decisions and say it's a fatal flaw instead of just being a design compromise, but in reality, it is effectively a design compromise. You're getting a much lower silhouette vehicle, you have less crew, you have less weight. Additionally, you can afford to armor more of the tank because now you have a smaller surface area to armor. The problem is you're basically conceding that any shell that enters the vehicle is going to go very badly for that vehicle. The Western design philosophy, which basically accepts that it's impossible to keep a shell out of your vehicles and to try to minimize damage and make the tanks as recoverable as possible if that happens, also has its weaknesses in that it results in significantly larger and heavier tanks on average. So it really is just a question of what works best for your nation. But obviously the crews of these tanks aren't really going to be seeing it that way when they have to drive past their comrades whose turrets have been popped off. The autoloader also has another kind of hidden disadvantage that isn't talked about as much, and that is because the tank is so small and is so compact, there's not a lot of room to expand the size of shell casings or expand the amount of room the autoloader has to move in order to accommodate a larger breach, which means you can't really get bigger powder charges to have a lot more muzzle velocity on these tanks. And this is a bit of an issue because even as early as the 60s and 70s, it was starting to be seen that NATO tanks could consistently outrange Soviet-era tanks. And this is why you start getting the anti-tank guided missiles that can be launched from the barrels of Soviet tanks. However, the T-72s were a lot less common to see fitted with this feature because you needed a special system for your gun to interface with the missile, and also the missiles themselves were quite expensive. So this is a comparison cost based on T-54s, but it at least gives you some idea of how expensive guided missiles are. A T-54 a few years ago, probably about a decade ago, would run for about $500,000 US. A system to allow to fire guided missiles would run for about $200,000 US, and each guided missile would run for about $250,000 US. So a full combat load of missiles for a T-54 would be as much as the T-54 itself. And this is part of the reason why relatively inexpensive tanks like T-72s rarely get this kind of upgrade, because typically if you can afford this upgrade, you can also afford a better tank. And the guided missiles themselves are kind of unicorns at this point. It's rare to see crews even issue them, much less use them in combat. In fact, it's hard to even find any recorded instances of that happening, which is why I always find it amusing when it's brought up in comparisons between Western tanks and Soviet tanks to point out that Soviet tanks actually have a range advantage because they have guided missiles. It's like, okay, but it's hard to even find crews that have even been issued those guided missiles, much less fire them. That being said, it's easy to go into the downsides of the T-72 without realizing all the upsides. T-72s are widely produced, they're very cheap to maintain. They also have a pretty healthy aftermarket with third-party upgrades, adding things like commander's thermal imaging systems and even things like remote weapon stations. So it's pretty easy to maintain them and even upgrade them to an extent within their own mechanical limitations. And ultimately, this is one of those things that people forget, is that not every nation is facing the prospect of fighting USA, China, Russia. A lot of nations in the world are just facing minor border disputes against enemies using older model late Cold War tanks, or local insurgents using RPG-7s and AKs. And in all of those instances, the T-72 is perfectly fine. If you were to invest, millions of dollars into something like, say, a Leclerc, okay, that would work, but that would also be kind of superfluous to your requirements, and you could get quite a few T-72s for that price. So at the end of the day, it's important to remember that while the T-72 isn't necessarily the best, it isn't trying to be the best. It is simply trying to fill the role as an inexpensive tank that basically anyone can operate. And this has resulted in it being a bit of a victim of its own success in that anybody does operate it. We kind of mentioned this with the Abrams video. Because the tank is so widely operated, it's also going to find itself in the hands of crews that don't really know what they're doing, or being commanded by generals who don't really know how to use them, or used by militaries that don't have access to good combined arms. And this all brings us back to the question of, is the T-72 underrated? And it's ultimately kind of a weird tank because it's the quintessential D- student sitting in the back of the class, barely does enough to work to pass, but it is passing the class. And this does kind of create an awkward scenario when you're trying to rate it because it's not trying to be the best tank. In fact, from inception, they knew it wasn't the best tank they could produce. It was simply there to fill out numbers, and in that job, it actually does it quite well. If somebody were to say the T-72 is obsolete, I would say they're completely wrong. This tank is a far cry from being obsolete. Has at least a few decades, if not significantly more in it, before it's even close to being obsolete. The shells it fires are still relevant. The 125mm high explosives are quite effective. The 125mm darts that it can fire are good enough in most situations. And the protection, good enough for most threats. It's not the best, but it's not trying to be the best, and in a lot of scenarios you don't need the best. You don't even need it to be really that good, you just need a tank, and that is a role the T-72 is uniquely good at filling, especially if you're on a bit of a budget, or maybe just need to fill out your numbers a bit so you can afford a few more of those elite high-tech tanks. And that concludes our video for today. Hope you liked it, hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and feel free to let me know your thoughts on the T-72. Do you think it's underrated? Do you think it's a hidden gem? Or do you think it's a piece of crap? Drop them down in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.